I want to open the discussion with a question and talk a little bit about something that you don't get into much detail about, the military assistance issue, because as you say, you don't deign to tell the military what to do. It's not your area of expertise, but you've certainly spoken to many, many people in the FSA, in Arab governments, and elsewhere who must have a lot of ideas about what is needed to change the dynamic. There is a stalemate, and that needs to be changed. What sort of, I mean, just sort of, we're not off the record, but here amongst friends.
There's nothing off the record.
what
to
should
be
be taken?
discreet in answering that, because, but the major Andrew has had extensive discussions on this with the opposition. But fundamentally, one of the key factors that are mitigating against the opposition is the monopoly of air power by the Syrian Air Force and the Syrian control of the skies. They obviously have armored tanks. That obviously is another area, but certainly the monopoly of the air by fighter jets, by helicopters, and by Scud missiles certainly gives the Syrian regime an undue advantage. And if there's anything that they're saying is that help us level the playing field in terms of Syrian air power.
They really want anti-aircraft.
I'm not going to go there. I don't want to be quoted, and I don't want Andrew to start saying something about what we say.
I'll just say there is probably well-known a shopping list that the FSA would like from Washington, and it goes a wide range of various things. But one of the things in terms of training that they kept raising is most of the armory they have been getting of late has been by capturing military depots and bases, which are predominantly Russian weaponry, and they need help better in training and using Russian weaponry. That is one thing they said to me as a area, but then there's also that shopping list, which is very well known, and some of that is just, in my personal estimation, that without any real training won't be that very effective on the ground. So it's a nice shopping list, but on the other hand, if there's no real way, if you don't have people trained in using those weaponry or which groups, it will not, in my opinion, be very effective.
Andrew is not recommending that the Russians start training the opposition in their weaponry. That would be a more even-handed approach on the part of Russia, however.
Just picking up on what Ed said about lessons we should learn from Iraq and the rather tragic events of the last decade. I'm sure that when you speak to people in the administration or in Congress, you'll also advise them on lessons we should have learned from working with the Iraqi opposition, which I started doing and you inherited in 1991, and it went on until 2003 with rather indifferent results. And I've not met many people in the Syrian opposition. They seem to be very civilized and cultured gentlemen and ladies, but then the same was true of the Iraqis that we were dealing with. And they started off saying, oh, we would never ask for direct U.S. military involvement. And then, well, just a no-fly zone in the north and one in the south. And you get into this slippery slope kind of problem. Can you offer, aside from what you've already said, which I find very plausible, can you offer any particular ideas on dealing with what is a very disparate and confusing to us people who are outsiders to the process, a confusing group of people who claim to be representing the Syrian people or the Syrian opposition?
Well, very astute comment, David, with all your experience also in the Iraqi paradigm. But I think the first thing is that this is an act in progress. The administration, from the knowledge we have, is very, very much engaged in trying to achieve and taking lessons from the pages of our Iraqi experience of getting a much more coherent and cohesive opposition not only in place, because it's not for us to place them, but to make them a more coherent whole, and to vet in terms of who we're going to assist, vet those people in the opposition who we feel are not non-radicals, if I can put it that way. And then to also try to get much more coordination between the outsiders and the insiders, which was a big issue in Iraq. And you have these local coordinating committees in Syria who are the people on the ground, but who are mostly doing communications and political work. Then you have the Free Syrian Army, and so all of that incrementally is moving in the right direction, but very slowly. And I think that one of the first things that needs to be done, and I really think the administration is doing this, and we have Robert Ford, who's doing a terrific job, in the field on this. He's our ambassador. He's no longer ambassador to Syria. He informed me that because international law, but he is our top envoy on the Syrian issue. And he is extensively involved with the opposition in trying to get them to a more coherent position politically in terms of their policy, their approach, and then how you translate that into the modalities of working with them on the military issues too. But there's really no honestly clear answer to your statement that if you go, for example, into a no-fly zone, how do you make sure you limit it there and you don't go into the fog of war? And I think if there's any hesitation on President Obama's part after Iraq and Afghanistan, he doesn't want to enter into the fog of war, and I don't blame him. I think he's absolutely right on that. You don't want to enter into the fog of war. But there are things that can be done, I think, that should be reasonably debated in the highest echelons of our national security establishment on how this playing field should be leveled a bit more. And that's difficult, but all the tough foreign policy issues or national security issues are difficult.
Could you please identify yourself?
Walt Cutler, former Foreign Service. I've been interested from the very beginning in the Saudi role. The Saudis traditionally have wanted to be more in the middle of the pack on regional issues, but from the very beginning they've been out in front along the gutteries. And I assume that this is something that we would welcome from the standpoint of being helping through them rather than as directly as possible. But would you want to comment on the role of those two countries?
Well, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have played an outsized role in terms not only of their financial and military support of the opposition groups, because they're supporting different entities within the opposition, but also politically. They feel that much more should be done to overthrow this regime. They are categorically opposed to Bashar al-Assad's regime, each for their own reasons. I think the Saudis have been deceived by Bashar al-Assad because, if you look back, the young man was mentored by the Saudis and the king, and he turned out to be a very bad pupil. And the Qataris have their own reasons to oppose the regime, and it's also a factor. If some people, and I'm not, this is a subject for a PhD thesis, is that what the Saudis and the Qataris are doing is also part of the Sunni-Shia divide, that you have a Alawite minority, a Shiite heterodox group in power in Damascus, and of course the strategic alliance that Hafez al-Assad took the initiative and put in place between Syria and Iran was basically predicated, as Chris well knows, to envelop Saddam Hussein's Iraq. I mean, the two rival Ba'ath parties and the two leaders. And so Hafez al-Assad established this strategic relationship. It had nothing to do, I think, with his Alawite Shiite, but it was a strategic alliance he went into to isolate or envelop Saddam Hussein on the east and on the west. Syria would try to contain, his machinations on the west, and Iran on the east. The son has inherited that strategic alliance, but it's in an entirely different setting now with the fall of Saddam Hussein, and it's basically to have a major supporter, and the Iranians have vast interests in having a presence in the, as Hafez al-Assad would remind us, the beating heart of the Arab world, in Syria, and also as a nexus for support of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So if there's any Shiite outreach in the Levant, it's really from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah. And the Saudis and the Qataris they're very concerned about that. So I think the Iranians already strategically are on the losing end of this because Bashar al-Assad is on the ropes. So they no longer have a strong regime in Syria that is their ally, still their ally. I mean, they're financing the regime seriously. They have troops on the ground, the Iranians, in Syria, and training. But in the strategically, since I think we all agree we're going to go into a post-Assad era, this strategic alliance between Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah is going to wither away. When you have a Sunni majority government come into power in Damascus, I don't think the Iranian Syrian axis is going to remain. And then Hezbollah has to then figure out its role as a Lebanese armed militia political party. So I think this, to answer your question a long-winded way, this is why the Saudis and the Qataris are involved. This is why they're involved. And but they're working. Their efforts should be put into a larger whole of the assistance to the opposition. There's too much, as the Syrian opposition have told us, there's just too much single strands of assistance coming from different parties, and that's not helpful.
I think a brief note on the Saudi relationship with Syria, with King Abdullah very much tried in 2005 or after 2005 on negotiations on Lebanon. But as those increasingly fell apart, and Hariri's premiership then ending further on, he felt, from what I've heard from people who work with the royal court in Riyadh, he felt very personally betrayed. And there was a brief period after that where the Saudis and Assad started to have some dialogue. But then as the violence started to break out in Syria, I think there was this feeling in Riyadh that you could do business with Hafez al-Assad, but the son never proved to be that business partner. And with the funding on the Saudis, the challenge they've had is that while Riyadh has taken a very strong stance in predominantly directing funding to the Free Syrian Army and to the established opposition, there are private individuals and long-standing tribal links which complicate funding going from the Gulf which makes it a difficult, the public versus private challenges in supporting the Syrian opposition. So you get, at times, two different groups supported.
Question from a journalist?
My name is Tamam Al-Barazi from Syria Al-Ghat TV. Mr. Djerejian, I mean, you refer to Iraq, but also I refer to Algeria. You remember when your doctrine almost, when they
You're
reached...
not going to bring up my Meridian
I
House
know,
speech.
but by saying
You're
that
gonna
when
bring up the Meridian
the
House
Islamists, reach the power, they will kick the ladder. That's
true.
That's a quotation from you. You repeated
What did I say?
When the Islamists...
What am I quoted as saying?
When the Islamists reach power, they will kick the ladder. You repeat that during you being Assistant Secretary of State.
But I said it much more eloquently.
Anyway, I know, of course. But since you also mentioned that if we have election in the Arab world, we will have Islamists, like in Cairo or in Tunis. But what I'm saying, I mean, still, your ideas and your colleague ideas and your fear of Islamists coming to power, I mean, why it is persisting in Syria, away from Jabhat al-Nusra, the mainstream Islamists, the Jabhat al-Tahrir al-Islamiyya, or in Syria, or the Muslim Brotherhood. Why this persistence of Islamic phobia of Syrian coming to power, Islamists coming to power? Why? I mean,
Well, it's really not a question of Islamic phobia. On the contrary, if you read the Meridian House speech that Walter Cutler invited me to, it is probably one of the more important things I ever did in the Foreign Service, was to give that speech. But you'll remember at the time, you mentioned Algeria, 1992, the Islamic Salvation Front would have won those elections had the army not intervened. And all we said at that time, because we could not influence the outcome of the Algerian elections. The French had a much better opportunity to influence things if any outside power was going to do it. But the question I raised in the Meridian House speech at the time is that the infamous quote that while the United States is for one person, one vote, the United States is not for one person, one vote, one time. That made the headlines. And of course, in the Arabic press, it was translated one man, one vote, one time. And that has stuck and it's amazing how people will interpret that, as you just have, as anti-Islamist, and conservatives will interpret that in a different way. It's really interesting the way, and I always felt I did something right in that speech when both sides started attacking me. But the point here is that if you read the speech, it's not Islamophobia. What we're saying is that if Islamic groups come to power, as they very necessarily will in the Arab world, we will be judging them on how they govern. That was the basic message. And then we stated very clearly what the United States is for in terms of pluralism, democratic elections. What I meant by one man, one vote, one time is that if you're elected through the constitutional democratic process and you come into power, and once you're in power, then you destroy that very process to stay in power, there's something wrong with that. That's not what we would support. But that if you do accede to the one of the key principles of democracy, which is the alternation of power, you're voted in, you're in. You're voted out, you leave peacefully. If you have equal rights, if you allow for pluralism and diversity, et cetera, some of the key components of democracy, that we would support, even with an Islamist party in power. But what we would not support is the exclusion of minorities, the lack of pluralism, the lack of democracy. And we see this being tested out now in Egypt and Tunisia. Because we're no longer surprised, obviously, as I stated earlier, that Islamist groups are coming to power in countries in which you have relatively open elections, especially after the fall of the autocrats. But the Islamic Morsi and the Ikhwan al-Muslimin today is being tested in Egypt on how they can govern. It's about how they're governing. And as a very good Arab friend of mine told me, in terms of the Islamist parties, you cannot govern with Insha'Allah alone. You cannot be Morsi and your Minister of Human Resources or Employment or Minister of Labor says we've got our unemployment rate is this high, our youth unemployment rate is that high, and he can say Insha'Allah, litikala Allah. No. You have to have policies. Just like the autocrats had to have policies, and they did a very deficient job in most cases on it. So don't interpret the Meridian House speech in that because it is American policy. That speech became American policy in Democratic and Republican administrations. But what we're saying is that we will test groups that come to power in the Middle East, because we're only talking about the Middle East, if they stand up to the standards of what we consider to be, not in an arrogant way, the basic fundamentals of democratic rule.
Mohammed Shina, Voice of America. Ambassador Djerejian, Secretary Kerry told Congress yesterday that the United States is introducing some changes to its policy in Syria. Do you expect, by sending 200 soldiers to Jordan, that the U.S. would change its military assistance to the opposition? And Andrew, can you explain how can the U.S. help in capacity building during a civil war?
Okay, well, I can't prejudge what the administration is going to come out with in specifics, but I do think what the administration is leaning toward now is a more amplified humanitarian and economic assistance that's targeted to the goals I outlined for the opposition. So I think you're going to see a more robust administration position on assistance to Syria, which will include training and other things that I can't discuss, but there's no question that I think the administration is going to, as you're going to see from Secretary Kerry's remarks, there'll be a more robust position that's going to be taken soon on these issues. But training is something that I would consider personally, without having any knowledge of what specific decisions they're going to make. I think that's an area that certainly the United States can do effectively. And Andrew, you want to ask in terms of capacity building?
I think capacity building in a civil war has always been a challenge, and it's one that I know that the State Department has been taking a lot of initiatives in trying to work on local governance initiatives in the North that have been, I think, moderately successful. I think the main missing component still is that there's still a general absence of security. And even in these LACs, there's still not enough, at times, not enough even agreement on who should protect the town or the city. So it makes it very challenging. And I think that what our report tried to do was address some areas of trying to build that capacity by linking the local governance more so with the coalition, and trying to ideally bring the FSA Command Council more closely linked with the coalition, so there can be better civil-military relations. But with the absence now of kind of the civil-military relations, I think in the long term, though, these initiatives, even if they don't lead to the fruition immediately in that period of transition, there could at least be, in the long term down the road, these steps could help in the long term. But I think it's very difficult in a civil war, certainly.
Thank you. Firas Maqsad, Global Policy Advisors. Andrew, Mr. Ambassador, I really enjoyed what was a thoughtful presentation. Certainly, Russia continuing to try to find an overlap of interests with Russia is important to this. But in many ways, this is also a regional conflict where you have Iran on one side and our Gulf Arab allies on the other. The Iranians seem to be doing a much better job in reaching out to minorities and in exploiting ethnic and communal cleavages to their interests. Whether it's the Christians not only in Syria but also in Lebanon, they've succeeded in bringing a good portion of the Christian community to their side. In Aleppo, I witnessed firsthand an Iranian ambassador inviting the Bishop of Aleppo to come visit Bahrain, but also supplying minority groups with arms and training, as the way they put it, to defend themselves. It's very important that we in U.S. diplomacy stand and say that we are for minority rights in the region.
Absolutely.
But the Iranians are putting it to action.
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing, and what should the U.S. be doing on the minority issue, besides just saying that we are for minority rights?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good well, first of all, it's a very good observation, and I think that should be highlighted to the people in the administration, what you said about Iran's successful outreach to minorities, because Iran practices that in Iran. You know, the Iranians have always been, not always, but mostly tolerant of the minorities inside of Iran. And that outreach, I think, is very important. I think you're also right that we, beyond talking the talk, we should start walking the walk in terms of how the United States can support the future evolution of Syria in which the minority rights are protected. It's critical. There's a heritage there that simply should not be broken up, despite the humanitarian things. But you know, when you think in the Christian minorities there, the bedrock of the ancient Christian churches are in Syria, the patriarchs. Look at all the patriarchs of the Christian churches, the Syriacs, the Greek Orthodox, the Latins, the Armenians. I mean, this is something very important. The Druze, the other minorities that are in Syria. So I think what needs to be done in this context is that there has to be a more forthcoming policy approach on the part of the West, and especially the United States, on the issue of minorities, and that to make it very clear, like we did in the Meridian House speech, of what we're for and what we're against in the people who may come to power in Syria, and to make it very clear to them that what we're for is not only the inclusion of the minorities, but that the protection, security of the minorities, and that the the nature of our assistance and our support of the emerging power structure in Syria will be a important concomitant that will be on this issue. So much more has to be done on that. But I'm glad you brought up the Iranian thing, because I didn't realize how successful they have been with these groups.
I think, admittedly, unfortunately, the Iranians are offering many minority communities a much better deal. But unfortunately, that deal, it's not really, they're selling a deal that's not really even feasible. So the unfortunate thing in the short term is, Iran offers all these assurances, but in the long term, Iran is offering something that's not sustainable. And I think if the coalition can do a better job at engaging the Alawi community and more so with the Christians, there would be better dialogue and assurances. That would be a good step. And if the long term, if the Iranian government very much cared about these minority communities, they would be doing better outreach to the opposition. But that is not very much in Tehran's interest either. So it's unfortunately they're being sold a deal that they can't really deliver.
But the outreach to the Alawites is really important.
I take your point, that time is not on our side, and that the longer the conflict persists, the stronger are likely to be elements with which we have and should be having, considerable problems, elements, within the opposition. Now, this leads me to a question. Suppose the U.S. and more broadly the international community followed your advice. The advice that, in the report. Is this likely, is it realistic to assume that this will be decisive? That is to say, shorten the conflict, leading to a form of governance which, while Sunni dominated, will include protection for the minorities?
Well, that's certainly our hope. I mean, but we can't stand here and predict that the outcome would be that successful. But the basic analysis there is that the longer the bloodletting continues, put aside our humanitarian concerns, to say major, but
yes, necessary, but is it reasonable to assume that it's sufficient?
It needs to be bolstered. The effort needs to be bolstered along the lines we recommend in the report. It needs to be bolstered.
I think Iraq is to recommend a book, Toby Dodge's book on Maliki, where he makes the argument about the military sectarianism and the militarization of an identity, and how that breakdown of that period of insecurity led to some of the militarization of identities. And I think the longer that goes on, the worse it will be. So will this be this certainly is not panacea to everything, but these at least could lead to a dialogue. That is not happening, clearly, at the moment, either between Damascus and the opposition. That could lead to something better. But at the moment, without that dialogue, I don't see really a peaceful landing once Assad goes.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Kafka. I had two questions. One, I wondered if you could go through what your understanding is of the administration's reluctance to provide the kind of military assistance that you advocate, and why you think those reasons are inappropriate or not should not be binding. And the other question is...
That's a question enough.
Yes. You advocate in the end a negotiated solution. And I wonder, what should Bashar al-Assad find in his interest in coming to any table ever? Because he's gone far enough that he's damned whatever he does. So why should he not fight till the very end?
Well, I think that's the latter question. I mean, that is the conundrum, because if his intent is to remain in power in one way or another, I don't think there could be any productive negotiations. There was a period of time earlier on when, you'll remember, there was some talk of his naming his high-level Sunni vice president, Farouk Ashara. to be the interlocutor between the regime and the opposition. There was still much more hope at that point that a serious dialogue could be entered into, in which there would be a transition period, perhaps leading up to 2014 elections, but in which the opposition would be invited in, the regime would participate, but with the likelihood that, you know, Assad no longer would be there. That could have been a more dignified exodus. But when we say time is not on our side, every month that this goes on, your analysis becomes more and more correct. That what does he have to lose? He's going to go down fighting, and that's it. Now, again, as we mentioned, all of this process can be short-circuited by some event that's unforeseen, and he's no longer there, or something happens within the regime. And then we're back to, you know, what is the future of the Syrian state in this chaotic situation? See. What was your first question? Oh, the administration, yes. Well, look, I can certainly understand President Obama's position in terms of not engaging the United States in a situation that could lead into the fog of war and lead to yet another American military involvement in an Arab or Muslim country, which would necessitate an overcommitment militarily. You know, if you look at the public opinion polls in America, the United States no longer wants. If one can speak about the American people, there's a great reluctance to get involved in yet another war after our long engagement in Afghanistan, which the President is committed to get us out of in 2014, and that he did live up to his commitment to get us out of Iraq in 2011. The end game in Iraq is very untidy. And the end game in Afghanistan will most likely prove to be very untidy. And so, and if you take a look at what the President decided in Libya, it was leading from behind, but very effectively from behind, because without our carriers and our military capabilities, the British and the French and our European allies, our coalitions, could not have secured a no-fly zone over Libya. So I think it's a policy of maybe one step backwards, but, you know, leading, if you could call it leading from behind, but a strategic reluctance to get the United States overcommitted in yet another overextended military commitment in the Arab world. I could understand that. But having said that, and if you read the report, we feel that given the Syrian situation on the ground, there has to be a more assertive military posture, but one that would avoid these overextended commitments.
All right, it's very warm in here. We wanted you to experience the Damascus summer, so we'll just take one last question.
Yes, Chris Ross. I'm Ed Djerejian's student. Indeed I am. You mentioned that the essential need here is for a political solution. Yet that political solution seems to me depends on some kind of outcome of a military
That's correct.
equation. And my sense is that unless something decisive happens to shift the military balance within or from without, this can go on forever, you say. But Bashar al-Assad's perception is that he can hang on. Our perception is that he's on the ropes. Unless there's a change in the military position, I don't know which one is right.
Right. Well, you're buttressing the whole purpose that we wrote this report. And our recommendations actually support your analysis, Chris, that somehow the military equation has to be shifted so that what you rightfully analyze, this prolonged tragic agony does not continue. But how to do it is a great challenge, and also in terms of Barbara's question here, in terms of getting overcommitted in a military situation on the ground in another Arab country. But that's the whole purpose. But it's the major reason we wrote this report is what you stated.
But do you think it's inevitable that we do become more militarily engaged at some point? In other words, we're heading toward that.
I've learned in Washington, inevitability is not a word I ever use. But I mean, that's what we're recommending in terms. But please, the takeaway is a more assertive military assistance program that is tightly tied to capacity building of the political opposition in Syria. There's no military solution to this conflict. has to be a political solution.
I think one
Thank you.
final...
No, that's enough. That's it.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. We have to go.
Andrew has a point.
Okay, all right.
Thank you to Ambassador Djerejian and Andrew Bowen for an excellent presentation. Please check out the report. Thank you.